Well, hi, everybody. Welcome to the CoronaSphere Lounge. I'm your host, Bill Whittle, coming to you live from the plane of infinite despair. And it's good to see everybody. The last show was very, very tired. Probably showed. Some interesting thoughts for today, as always. It's what you're here for. It's not what I'm here for. But in any event, some more good news, and we'll talk about that in just a second. In the comment section before we get started, people were talking about whether it's, everybody's feeling like it's time to quit China. And it just teed me up to say just this. Earlier today, about 4 hours ago, I put the final period at the end of the final sentence of the 17,000 words that made up episode 13 of the Cold War, What We Saw. I finished it this afternoon. And when you get down to adding that, which followed immediately on the Apollo 11 thing, I've been basically having this enormous writing sword over my head for almost nearly a year now, very, very close to a year. But one of the things that struck me about the Chinese response to this is how tone deaf they really must be and are. When you look at these totalitarian states and the pablum they just keep force feeding their people, the people don't believe it, but there's no feedback loop. So the Chinese continue to do it. They continue, the 1.4 billion people, and they're telling us, 3,000 dead. Some estimates have been probably, I think a realistic estimate is probably in the neighborhood of about 90,000 dead in China. But my point is that this continues to go on. They actually think that that people believe this, that they do. And fortunately for them, there are useful idiots here who continue to report the numbers from China, where they're having great success containing the COVID-19 virus. And sometimes, you just look at it, it's just like, no, it's useful idiots all the way down. But since I live in a totalitarian state, this is what I got from just having spent so much time mentally in the Soviet Union, is that there's no feedback loop. My wife grew up in the Brezhnev years, and she told me that as a kid growing up, everybody was expected to be part of the parade and hold up the pictures and all the rest of it, and listen to the ongoing, Communist Party lectures and work one Saturday a month, all the stuff. They did it, but none of them believed it. None of them. And since they did it but didn't believe it, there was no way for the Soviet leadership to know just how completely disenchanted the population was, so they keep on cranking out the stuff that's obvious to children. There's no possible way that anybody other than an ancient Chinese communist could believe that we believe that that they have 3,000 dead and that they haven't had any new cases except for 2, which were caused by foreigners. It's just every single day that they continue to lie. It's just another arrow into Saint Stephen, I guess. It's just another sting. It's like, oh, okay, you're going to keep it up again today, are you? You're going to, okay, fine, got it. Anyway, they still continue to parrot this among the paid or unpaid communists here in the American news media. But in any event, it's strikingly tone deaf, and enough about that. Okay, so moving on, we have a fun topic for today. It's hardly fun, but it's somewhat upbeat, I would think. And one more time, here it is. Did we pull it off? Well, as a student of history, I noticed that there is of all the things that I've studied in military history, and it's not like I sat down to study them, I just enjoy reading them. I would say the single most common thread that goes through every battle, every historical battle, every battle that's worth recording and writing about, and I can't think of any exceptions off the top of my head, and there may not be more than 3 or 4 if I really dug into it. The common thread in every single historical battle has been, to me, every single time, that the victory would have been so much more complete if the people hadn't started celebrating early. It's unbelievable how many times this has happened. Maybe Canny is a good example of that not happening. But generally speaking, once the enemy line breaks and the soldiers start running, that's when the real killing happens. It's very easy to kill a soldier who's running away from you, whether you do it with a spear or a rock or a lance or a saber or a rifle or a machine gun. Or an A-10 for that matter. But once that breaks, it's almost impossible to stop victorious soldiers from celebrating, and virtually impossible to get them to continue doing what they had done so well. So I say all of this only to say that that we are still a long, long way to go before we're out of this Communist Party nightmare that was inflicted upon us. But with that said, some good news here. So take a look at this. Now, it's not a very long period of data, but it's good. Here's New York State in terms of active cases, and that's, well, technically 5 days of decline, 4 days of like serious, noticeable decline. The recording for the 12th, which is yesterday, as we record this on the 13th, is what, maybe 2/3 of the peak, getting close to half the peak. That's very good news. The news from the city, New York City, is virtually the same. There's New York City. Only 3 days of decline here, rather than a few more as we got with New York State, but nevertheless, it's definitely there. Something's happening. So we may have turned the corner on this. I suspect we probably have. It's too early to start celebrating and get off our horses and all the rest of it. We're still deep, deep, deep into this. But the question then, I think, that starts presenting itself is, did we actually pull it off? Did we do it? Just pretty much everything I do, and the Cold War, what we saw story from earlier is actually a really good example of this. I don't have, it seems to me like the job that I do is to just kind of scan lots and lots and lots and lots of data, and just, it's more intuitive than anything. There's some very, very deep thinkers out there, and I don't think I'm one of them, but I do listen to them, and I listen to what people are saying, and I try to surround myself from as much data as I can, and then I don't really bore into it. I just kind of sit back and like to feel which way it's flowing. And I think that, having watched now for the last month, I really do think that we look back on this, and I think that, we actually did pull it off. The numbers continue to be marked out. And when I say pull it off, look, let me just say, I should have started with this. And I deeply regret that I did not. Every single one of these deaths is a tragedy. It's an avoidable tragedy as well. And I don't mean to suggest that if somebody died as a result of COVID-19, but it wasn't as many people as we thought, hey, woohoo, it's time to go out and dance. I don't mean to say that at all. I'm speaking about big trends, and every single one of these cases has been just heartbreaking, considering how it started and the lies that perpetrated it and could have stopped it if they'd been telling the truth. But anyway, back to the main point. When I say pull it off, My definition of pulling it off, I think, is pretty much the same as the entire idea of flattening the curve. In other words, every single death, and we were near what 700-800 a day in New York. I don't remember what the actual number was. Could have gotten pretty close to 1,000. That's a 9/11 every 3 or 4 days. But the definition for me of pulling it off was the difference between having hospitals filled with patients. That's serious and exhausting. But the horror, the nightmare for me anyway, was the idea that the healthcare system would be overwhelmed, that there would be patients in the aisles, that people would be having heart attacks and be in a line out the street on the sidewalk, that all of this horror would have been for me simply that, and that does not appear to have happened. Um, and and here's the problem. And when I say a problem, it's a political problem. Because if you want to get down to lives saved, I am utterly convinced, I've been watching this data as much as I could every day. I am utterly convinced that not only did social distancing flatten the curve, I don't think anybody had the faintest idea at all of how effective this was going to be. I just think, I don't think they'll understand it for another year or two. I do not believe that people had, let me rephrase that. The effect that I've seen looking at the temperatures and how short of the peak catastrophe we came, I don't think anybody could have predicted how effective this was. And now we get to the political problem. And the political problem is a horrible tragedy of a problem. It makes the disease seem bearable by its contrast. It is a loathsome, revolting calculation, and I feel guilty even talking about it, but nevertheless, here it is. We will never know how effective the social distancing was unless we didn't do it. I'm sure someday somebody will have a mathematical model to show us what it did, but it not only knocked down the COVID-19 fevers and high temperatures, which are symptoms of a serious case of the COVID-19 virus. It not only knocked them down to flu levels, it knocked them to zero, almost zero. There's almost nobody running any fevers in this country. Seasonal flu is essentially stopped in the United States as a result of this social distancing. Now, obviously, there's a huge cost, and obviously we all want to get back to work. But the problem is that we will never know how effective it was because we did it. People who claim that this was overblown from the beginning, look, I'm not talking about the reaction. I'm not talking about the shutting down the economy. That's a great argument. There's plenty of stuff to talk about there. And I'm not saying that it was necessary to do everything we did, but we didn't know what we didn't know. So just from the point of view of the virus, the people who said that the whole thing was overblown are in a position where they point to the low numbers and say it was overblown. But to me, looking at how those curves just dropped, I mean, they were just heading up, up, up. To me, the low numbers are not an indication that the original models were wrong or that the original forecasts of the mortality or of this disease were off. It tells me that the social distancing was beyond our imagination in terms of success. Now, I'm not going to get into the economy now because it's a whole different story, and we'll probably talk about that tomorrow, getting it back into work. But if you look at the numbers of deaths per million, the United States is what's the word I'm looking for? It's a full figure off. I mean, we are in double digits, somewhere around 50 or 60, I want to say, deaths per thousand. But the UK and Europe is at least 170, something like that. So it's not a question of cheerleading, although there is a bit of that in me, I have to tell you. It is an order of magnitude better, as John points out. It's an order of magnitude better here than it was in Europe, and it must be 3 orders of magnitude better than what happened in China. But the question will forever be there. And the issue will never be decided, I'm sorry to say, and I don't know what the answer to that is. The issue that will never be decided will be, was it worth it? And when people look at the lower than expected mortality numbers and say, see, it wasn't that bad after all. That sense I talked about earlier about just kind of processing as much data as I could tells me no, that's not the case. This was going to be a six-figure, seven-figure reaper coming through this society, and it didn't happen. And I think it didn't happen because of what we did. And I do want to just address one more thing, because it's tough to get into the details of this. We can save that for later in the week. But I am speaking exclusively for myself here. For those people, and I'm not referring to members of Whittle.com. I'm not referring to our audience at all. There are audiences out there that I've seen. Forget the media and the left and pinning it on Trump. I'm not talking about them at all. Just take them off the table. Those people are just nuts and evil. This whole hydrochloroquine thing with saying, oh, it doesn't work, and trying to ban it just because Trump pointed out that it did work. It's just revolting. I'm not talking about that. But on the good guy team, I've seen people saying, this is it, our freedoms are gone, we'll never see them back again, and so on. And all I can do to address that is to tell you my personal feelings about this and my personal calculation about this. California got the first order for sheltering at home, which is a nice way of saying, you're basically locked in the house. California got it first. And I got the news live during a CoronaSphere Lounge, and I was pretty upset. I remain a little upset about it. And I thought the message was unclear and so on. But here's my point. Not only did it say in the fine print that this was not going to be enforced by the police, but at no point during the last 30 days have I seen any sense of coercion at all. And this is in the People's Republic of California. I mean, not a hint of it, nothing. Now, I know you can point out a number of cases. They're shutting down the churches. There was apparently they raided some Amish wedding or some nonsense like this. It's not to say that there haven't been outrageous abuses of power in this country. I'm not that naive. Of course there has been, and the governor of Michigan seems to be really setting a pretty high bar in terms of tyranny there. But my point is that the fact that these are news stories that we can point out as individual transgressions. And Rubber City Rebel says, what about the Malibu paddle boarder? Yeah, probably the best example of all. There's a guy out there in the bay, and he's on a paddleboard by himself with the breeze blowing, and the police arrest him for violating social distancing laws. That kind of thing is there. I'm not denying it. I'm not saying it's not a threat. I'm not saying any of that. These little people who have to tell other people what to do, this has been a godsend for them. But put all of that into the context of 340 million people. And at no point was I'm speaking for myself, I'm not speaking for anybody else. At no point in this entire process was I ever coerced into doing this. It was something that I did on a voluntary basis. And to me, that's the difference between an emergency and a coup. It's the difference between an act of God or a meteor that comes out of the sky. It's certainly not an act of God. It's an act of the Chinese Communist Party, but you get the idea. It is something that descended upon this culture out of nowhere, and it was not a political move. I am personally 100% convinced that we will quickly return to normal. And furthermore, for reasons I've stated before and for things that we'll get into later in the week as well, I'm personally absolutely convinced that we're going to come out of this much freer than we went into it. I really, genuinely, honest to God, believe it. You can list all of the exceptions that you want to, but you will run out of exceptions. There's not that many stories, 15, 20 stories of cases where people were coerced by overeager law enforcement. The paddleboard guy is a great example, and so on. But when you get down to the percentage of cases that consisted of, it's almost impossible to expect 330, 40 million people to not have some kind of outliers like that. And see, we're hearing stories, and this is why I think this makes my point. I see in the comment section from Lysoyas says, affluent neighborhood in Orlando, Florida, cops arrest a man playing catch with his 9-year-old daughter in a vacant field. Yes, that is an absolute abuse of power, and that is inexcusable. And people will take power. There's no question about it. But the reason it's news is because it's news. I went along with this because I wanted to save American lives. And I want to get back to work now because I want to save American lives. And I will listen to the people who understand the mathematics of an epidemic. That's what I'm interested in. I'm not interested in the politics of it. I've seen the politics of it. And what I've seen has been good and bad. I've seen the politicians, mostly on the part of the Democrats, but then again, those Republican congressmen dumping stock when they got the news. And the media has been catastrophic. But the American people, I think, have been champions. Champions. I personally have never seen a single person angry, upset, or scared. Everybody that I've run into were upbeat, cheerful, helpful, and so on, and kinder than usual. And I'm enormously proud of that. I'm especially proud of that when you couple it with what appears to be this order of magnitude lower fatality rate that we're showing compared to other countries. And so if we have turned the corner on this, and those charts we saw earlier indicate that we probably have, and if it turns out, here, see, for instance, I saw an article yesterday or 2 days ago that said somebody done some math, and there have been criticism of the math, but basically the guy was saying that we are 100 times safer now than we were a month ago, because a month ago, all of these infections were festering. People were infected and didn't know it. And now, when we see these cases coming down, we're actually 10 days or up to 20 days, 28 days delayed. We were delayed going into it, we're delayed coming out of it. But I feel like we just did a monumental thing. And sorry, my vision's not what it used to be. DCG 44S in the comment section says Attorney General Barr is going to go after politicians targeting religious services. Good on him. I agree too. If we come out of this, forget if we come out of it. Here's the state of the country right now. If it turns out that the Attorney General of the United States is going to look into bringing charges against local politicians who exceeded their authority, then that to me is telling me that no, this is not the end of our freedom. On the contrary, I think this has just done so much to destroy this creeping socialism, this creeping bureaucracy, this creeping, drifting kind of somnambulistic, walking over the cliff thing. I think we're going to come out of this much, much freer than we went into it. And if those people tell me that that mathematically, here's the incubation period, here's the R naught, here's the number of people it infects, and so on. If they tell me that we need to stay sheltered for another 2 weeks or 3, okay, I don't like it, but I'm not going to lose the victory by celebrating on the battlefield. That's my entire point of this episode. I don't want to do what I've seen every single military battle in history, with 3 exceptions, do. I don't want to lose the victory by celebrating on the battlefield. So we'll see. But clearly now, I think all across the board, I don't know if you feel it. I feel it. And today was the first day I really felt it. That we seem to have passed the worst. Now, John Galt makes a perfectly legitimate point, and he says, no offense, Bill, but you're not going to lose your job over it. Half of America might. That's true. That is absolutely true. Um, but when, let me rephrase this, I would not have done anything differently. If I was doing my former work as an editor in a studio, that would have been closed down right at the beginning. And I would not have done anything differently. It's pointless for me to say that I would do it. You're just going to have to take my word for it. But I would not have done anything differently. And now the question is, how much of this damage is permanent? I hope, and there's so much that we didn't know and still don't know. We don't know how quickly you can revive an economy by simply stopping the medically induced coma that it went into. I don't think this has ever happened before. I'm not aware of it. I am not aware ever of an economy that was simply stopped artificially. And by the way, I saw some numbers about stopped. When you look at the number of visitors to transit the station, it's a long story, but it basically looked like about 50% of the country, maybe in some areas 60% of the country stopped working. It's not like the whole thing shut down, but nevertheless, we've never seen this before, and we don't know what's going to happen when we stop this anesthesia drip and say, okay, let's see if the patient comes back. We don't know if this person's going to require, a year of physical therapy, or the patient may just simply wake up, leap out of the bed, and decide to jog home. We don't know. I kind of inclined to believe it's going to be more of the latter than the former. But once again, it's what we don't know. So at this point in it, I guess all I would say in conclusion is pretty much this. This outbreak, this pandemic, has taught us a lot of lessons. And it's taught us the same kind of lessons that 9/11 taught us about terrorism, and that Pearl Harbor taught us about the efficacy of radar as a means of detecting incoming massed airstrikes. We haven't made those mistakes again. I know we won't make. We will do much better next time. Well, there's some other things that we won't fix until we hit it, but that's human nature. With all of that said, by weird chance, and maybe it was just as the coronavirus was just starting to make the news in end of December, I want to say it was somewhere around there, early January, I just decided I was going to, reading all the time, I decided to read about the great flu pandemic of 1918, 1919. And the disturbing thing about that is the thing that's disturbed me about this one, and that was that in that pandemic, the flu virus came in the spring and did a fair amount of damage, but it was the fall where it came back, and it was far, far more virulent, much, much deadlier. And that's what did a lot of the real killing. Just 40 million people worldwide or more. But this is different. It really is. It's different. It's different because of what we've accomplished in the last century. I was reading an article earlier today, and the thing that struck me the most about this article was that if we had read this article, if I'd read this article to the absolute archetypical brilliant medical man of the last century, if Walter Reed was able to sit and read this article that I read today, I don't think he would have been able to understand 10 or 20% of it. I'll give you an example. The article, and I'll talk about this later in the week, is titled "Phage Capsid Against Influenza, Perfectly Fitting Inhibitor Prevents Viral Infection." And basically what they're saying is that German scientists who are, what's the name of that German institute? It'll come to me in just a second. I'm not going to waste a lot of time. It's the German institute that Johns Hopkins was basically based on. But basically, and we'll get into more detail about this, what this article says is that scientists have been able to take the protein shell that surrounds a virus, and they have been able to basically decoy all of the receptors on that virus. They have essentially figured out a way to put a protein shell around an influenza virus, and the virus binds to this protein cell thinking it's binding to lung tissue. That's the connection. And by simply overwhelming all of the virus's receptors and binding points, it essentially means it's the end of the flu, likely, possibly the end of the common cold. And I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, let me see if I can find an example. We have images of individual viruses. You can see the corona of the S spikes on an image of an actual virus, which was so much smaller than a bacteria that 100 years ago nobody could. They knew it was there, but they couldn't imagine how tiny it was. So here's just a paragraph from this article. This will give you an idea why I'm feeling differently about the fall than I would have felt 100 years ago. Here's just a quick little sample. Would it not be possible? Let me try it again. It was the surface structure of flu viruses that inspired the researchers to ask the following initial question more than 6 years ago. They started working on SARS, by the way, and COVID-19 virus has been classified as SARS-2. It's essentially the same virus with interesting modifications. Here's the question. Would it not be possible to develop an inhibitor that binds to trivalent receptors with a perfect fit, simulating the surface of lung tissue cells? One more paragraph. And think about this if you're Walter Reed, a brilliant, brilliant, brilliant doctor, medical man, researcher, public health official who understood the epidemiology of things enough to be able to basically banish yellow fever from at least from the United States. What would Walter Reed have made out of this paragraph? This is the quote. They found that this is indeed possible with the help of a harmless intestinal inhabitant. The Q beta phage has the ideal surface properties and is excellently suited to equip it with ligands, in this case sugar molecules, as bait. An empty phage shell does the job perfectly. Our multivalent scaffold molecule is not infectious and comprises 180 identical proteins that are spaced out exactly as the trivalent receptors of the hemoglobin on the surface of the virus. That's hemagglutinin on the surface of the virus, explained Dr. Daniel Lauster, former PhD student in the group of molecular biophysics and now a postdoc at Freie University in Berlin. It therefore has the ideal starting conditions to deceive the influenza virus, or to be more precise, to attach to it with a perfect spatial fit. In other words, we use a phage virus to disable the influenza virus. And what he's saying there, which I am able to dimly perceive in the back of my chimp brain, is that these German scientists have been able to create a substance that binds to the actual spikes on the surface of a virus and overwhelms them to the point where they cannot attach themselves to lung tissue. And think about that language. When you talk about these actual proteins, when you talk about how the virus actually attacks a cell, you're talking on the molecular level. You are now talking about a molecule that has a certain shape that another shape can fit inside of. And once again, we're able to image these kind of things, or at least look at them on computers, and realize that we are now talking about assembling molecules, or at least selecting them on a molecular basis to determine which ones are going to lock up those sensors on the flu virus. And the virus in question is a dead virus. It's just the shell. There's nothing inside. There is no virus. It's just the protein shell. When you think about that, my worries about the fall are greatly relieved. This was the first pandemic that this planet has ever faced where we were armed and armored. We've learned a lot about this, and our weapons, just like our aircraft carriers and our anti-terrorism units and all the rest of that stuff, are getting better by the day. And next time this thing comes around, it's not going to be the same story. But when I think about the fall and the return of this virus, because it seems like it will rebound. The flu virus does it. It just seems like there's no reason why it wouldn't. And if it does come back in the fall, most of the time, if I understand correctly, most of the time diseases evolve and mutate into less um, virulent strains, less lethal strains. But if it comes back with the kind of just incandescent rage that it came back with in the 1919 pandemic, we are going to be waiting for it with molecules that we have custom designed to fit onto a shell of a strand of RNA. This virus doesn't have any idea who it's messing with. It doesn't have any idea. We got caught off guard on this one, and we didn't know what we didn't know, and that's human nature, and that's the way it is. But every single day that goes by is another day when people like those scientists in Germany and in America and in Israel and Japan, and I would say all around the world, but we're missing places like Iran's contribution to the biochemistry of it, and we're missing China's. The one lab that should be most equipped to tell us what this is and what it's doing is the P4 lab of viral laboratory in Wuhan, and they have gone off the grid. They just disappeared as far as any kind of contact with the rest of the medical community in the world. If anything comes out of that Wuhan laboratory, it is extremely limited and censored and so on. So we're not getting it from everywhere. But I never, ever fail to be astonished and impressed and proud of what these upright walking chimps have been able to accomplish. It is absolutely astonishing to me. Astonishing to me that you could put 3 of them in a tin can and send them to the moon and bring them back, and that these monkeys would eventually be able to massage individual molecules in order to overwhelm an enemy that has been with us from the beginning and has killed more humans than anything in history by far. It is absolutely astonishing to me, and I never, ever cease to be amazed by it, and I never cease to be proud of it either. I am just so spectacularly proud of being a human being. I know this is kind of a outdated belief, but I mean it. I am deadly serious. I am unspeakably proud of the human race. I just sat in slack jaw amazement at all of it. The human race is absolutely amazing. Members of the news media, not so much. But every product you make is going to have a couple of defects. That's human nature, I suppose. When it comes back, or when the next one comes back, it will encounter not just a a better prepared species if it returns, or if the next one returns, when the next one returns. It's not going to only encounter an ever smarter species. I don't know how many vaccines are in development right now. I know it's in excess of 40 different teams that have developed preliminary vaccines. And if this idea of overwhelming the receptors is feasible, that may be the end of viruses, period, as a threat to us. But we will be far better prepared for it when we see it again, because not only have we had time to develop vaccines, the one thing that we have done as a country, and it's Europe as well, but certainly Asia has a head start on this with us, we as a country have learned, like a muscle memory, not like school learning, just like muscle memory. We've learned, okay, so this is what it's like to go out with a mask on. And this is what it's like to wear gloves. And we won't have to wear masks and wear gloves forever. We will go back to the kind of world we had before, and it'll be a freer world. And when Dr. Dr. Fauci, who, despite all of the criticism from everybody, who I think has done a very, very good job, and all of them, the Surgeon General, all of them. Oh, you should have said this, or why didn't? No, they've done an amazing job, all of them. But when he says, the only thing I disagree with him about is not how he handles the epidemic. It's when he says, well, we will probably we'll never shake hands again. Like hell. Like hell, we won't. We absolutely will shake hands again. Lord Bios, who's been my guardian angel and my Jiminy Cricket through this whole procedure, says there are 469 clinical trials in progress for COVID-19 right now. 469 clinical trials in progress being tested on humans right this second. Communism is the virus. That's the one we're going to have to beat. And I think we're going to come out of this very, very well. But I do absolutely know that our lives are going to return to normal, that we'll be shaking hands and going to football games and all the rest. And the next time that this alarm goes off, and it will go off, I don't know if it'll go off again in my lifetime. I suspect it probably will. The next time it goes off, it's going to be an entirely different ballgame, because we have been through this drill. When it comes back, when somebody says, okay, there looks like a virus that's coming out of this area, there's not going to be any question about when we should shut down travel to that area. It'll be shut down immediately. And the testing lapses that we had, and the mask shortages, and the hand sanitizer shortages, and the toilet paper shortages, those things will have been learned lessons. And when these things start the outbreak next time, we're not going to just sit there and say, it's probably not going to happen, didn't happen last time. Next time, we're going to say, all right, we know what to do. And if this thing gets into the country, or starts in the country for that matter, if we decide to, my national fast food franchise of Bat Tacos is still on the drawing board and ready to go. I think Bat on a Stick is going to be extremely popular in the years to come, but that's just me and my own business plan. But with that said, we will know what to do. And when we hear that there's a pandemic in the future, we will say, okay, we're going to have to get the masks out again, or we're going to have to get the gloves out again. We'll probably have to do this for a month maybe. We will not shut down the economy the way that we did before. We will start to think about things differently because we've been there, because we know what we know when we didn't know what we didn't know before. That's about it for this edition of the CoronaSphere Lounge, made possible, as always, by the members at BillWhittle.com, who have, true enough, without any question, legitimately honest criticism of me being able to say that this was worthwhile. They have kept me working, and I have kept working for them. And if I was not working for them, I'd be working for somebody else. I'm happy to be here and providing whatever perspective I can. I think we're going to see a rebound, the likes of which is unparalleled in history, and I am very, very confident about our future, and I always have been. For the last 20 years now, really, especially around the turn of the century, maybe after 9/11 had died down, somewhere around 2003, 4, 5, somewhere in there, we started hearing that the American century was over, the 20th century was the American century, and that this is the Chinese century and the future belongs to them. I never, ever, ever believed it. Never. Not once. It never, ever, ever seemed like the truth to me. The private sector response to this virus and the humanity and the compassion and just the sheer goodwill, the idea that the entire city of New York, which is still the greatest city in the world, would stop what they're doing every day at 7 o'clock and clap their hands and bang on pots to let that entire city ring out with their admiration and respect and love of the people that were on the front lines, keeping them going, people stocking shelves in grocery stores and truck drivers, and in addition to the medics and the doctors and all the rest of it. When the Chinese just can't imagine this kind of a response. No, the future does not belong to them. The future is going to belong to any country that is freer than we are, and if that country ever comes along, I'll take a look at the real estate prices. But until then, this is it. And that's our charge, and that's what we're here to do. to defend this country, defend the freedom, and to save the lives of our people. Because when it's all said and done, the Chinese would rather lose thousands of people than lose face. And we're not built that way. And that's why it's going to be another American century, because this is how humans are supposed to behave. And so far, we have. We'll see you tomorrow right here on the CoronaSphere Lounge.